on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills, we shall never surrender.
They say that a picture paints 1,000 words, and the vivid archive images that you've just been watching of the Allied invasion of the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, certainly prove the point. This was D-Day, the beginning of the end of World War II, when American servicemen made the ultimate sacrifice, giving their lives in the struggle for liberty far from home as the world faced the menacing threat of the Axis powers. But this wasn't the first time in the 20th century that the world had faced the horror of global war. And the events that led up to that stormy D-Day morning all those years ago are truly fascinating. When the advancing German army of Adolf Hitler invaded the peaceful country of Poland in September 1939, the Second World War quickly became inevitable. It was barely 20 years earlier that the apparent war to end all wars had come to a bloody and exhausting conclusion. The so-called Great War of 1914 to 1918, conducted primarily on the European continent in trenches, across land and in the air, had many measures, treaties, and alliances put in place when it ended to stop such an atrocity happening again. But none of them could hold back the well-oiled and well-drilled Nazi war machine of Germany. The Great Economic Depression and the heavy penalties imposed upon Germany after World War I had given rise to disenchantment, and a staunch nationalist approach had developed, as Adolf Hitler and his Nazis forged a route into politics that would rally Germany's demoralized citizens. Throughout the 1930s, the world looked on as Hitler became a greater and greater threat until all diplomatic efforts to stop him had been exhausted. The scale and scope of this Second World War would eclipse its predecessor and go down in history as the biggest, costliest, and most devastating war of all. As was the case with the First World War, the American nation initially stayed out of what was essentially viewed as a European conflict. This was far from avoidance, but simply a sensible, reasoned protection of its country and its countrymen. However, an unprovoked and deadly attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii in December 1941 solidified a divided nation on the need to go to war and join the Allies, which included the United Kingdom and Canada, against the axis of evil, Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Pearl Harbor attack is seen as one of the major turning points in World War II because it proved that nowhere in the world was safe and nothing in the world was sacred. It was like a peaceful, slumbering giant had been poked and prodded until irritation turned to rage and resentment. During the brief attack on Pearl Harbor, over 2,000 American servicemen lost their lives. Many ships and airplanes were destroyed, and the Pacific Ocean was left unguarded for a resultant 6 months. This allowed the Japanese to further invade and capture Southeast Asia, the entire Southwest Pacific, and to extend its reach far into the Indian Ocean. By 1944, the war had been raging for 5 horrific years. The Battle of Stalingrad had turned the war in the Allies' favor by breaking the German army's stranglehold in Russia, and the Soviet army began advancing through Eastern Europe. Italy was about to be liberated from German occupation, causing the rise of its put-upon people and the eventual execution of their dictator Mussolini and all his officials and ministers. The time had now come for the liberation of Western Europe, an event that seemed crucial for the eventual outcome of the war. Hundreds of Allied ships were used to transport the soldiers, vehicles, and supplies across the English Channel to the shores of Normandy in France in order to invade German-held territory. The invasion of France on June 6, 1944 was the biggest and greatest invasion across the English Channel since 1066. Centuries earlier, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, had amassed a fleet of 600 ships and an army of 7,000 men to invade the British Isles. His plans had been delayed by the weather conditions, much like the D-Day plans of 1944, but he eventually crossed the English Channel and defeated the English, taking the crown of King Harold during the famous Battle of Hastings. Like D-Day, it was an important watershed in history, for it began one of the most powerful European monarchies, altered the English language and culture, and set the stage for the many English and French conflicts to come. D-Day, on the other hand, signaled a unity between England and France against Hitler's empire-building tactics as the Allied forces pushed through France, over the Rhine, and into the heartland of the Third Reich. Like William the Conqueror's 1066 invasion, this Allied attack helped to destroy tyranny and allowed democracy to reign throughout the world. Codename Operation Overlord, this is the story of D-Day, the American way. From the beginning, there was always an unpromising outlook for a frontal assault on Nazi-controlled Europe. The British forces had always considered it to be a too difficult proposition because of the unpredictability of the English Channel, a stretch of water that was only about 20 miles wide when at its narrowest point between England and France. The weather, at worst, made it extremely treacherous to cross and had put paid to many similar invasions from Europe since the success of William the Conqueror in 1066. The often overlooked fact that his invasion force was delayed by the weather affecting the sea shows that this small distance was traditionally tough to overcome. Upon the American arrival into World War II, the manpower of the Allied forces increased massively. But the main advantage of this slumbering giant's awakening was the huge upsurge in firepower and weaponry that it began manufacturing out of its factories and foundries. In a very short time span, something like 90,000 tanks and 240,000 airplanes were produced, not to mention a mammoth number of Army transport vehicles. Without the worry of financial constraints, thanks to the great spirit of cooperation between America's President Roosevelt and Great Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the tide against Hitler slowly but surely took a turn for the better. In fact, Operation Overlord first came into being long before the eventual D-Day happened. Immediately after President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced his declaration of war on Japan and Germany, he asked his Chief of Staff to come up with a plan to mount and carry out an operation with forces and equipment established in the United Kingdom to secure a lodgment on the continent from which further offensive operations could be developed. The lodgment area must contain sufficient port facilities to maintain a force of some 26 to 30 divisions, and enable that force to be augmented by follow-up shipments from the United States or elsewhere of additional divisions and supporting units at the rate of 3 to 5 divisions per month. This initial objective was codenamed Operation Roundup and showed that once America had entered the war, it wanted to get the whole thing done and dusted in the shortest time possible. In fact, the Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, was the man responsible for turning America into a fighting force. And he did so with such gusto that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill referred to him as the organizer of victory. It was he who led the arguments that an invasion across the English Channel would be more beneficial than the British thinking of conducting a Mediterranean campaign and increased bombing of the German homeland. Operation Roundup was eventually given the go-ahead, renamed Operation Overlord, and entrusted to Marshall's fast-tracked understudy, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would later go on to become America's 34th president. The British were ever cautious and postponed the initial invasion plans until a significant army of soldiers and array of weaponry and armory could be built up. This influx of men and machinery was codenamed Operation Bolero. Towards the end of January 1942, the beginnings of Operation Bolero saw the arrival in Northern Ireland of the first units of the U.S. Army. It was also the month in which an official announcement was made about the location of the U.S. Army headquarters, established in Bristol, England. Between the setup of the U.S. Army headquarters and the invasion of France by the Allied forces, the vast increase and buildup of men and machinery began in earnest. Because of the many German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic Ocean, the decision was made to avoid shipping the war materials whenever possible in favor of an air route from America via Greenland, Iceland, and Scotland. Any shipping supplies would come into Britain via the west coast and through the Bristol Channel ports nearby the American headquarters. As Britain was only half the size of just one of the 50 states of America, the influx could have been absolute chaos. Luckily, this wasn't the case, and new military camps were set up in and around the towns of South Wales, Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, and Gloucestershire. What once had been a peaceful grazing ground for sheep, horses, and cattle became transformed into a home away from home for American guns, aircraft, ammunition, and tanks. However, the British were still noticeably reticent on the feasibility of an all-out attack. Having lost heavily in recent battles, they didn't need another huge loss to put a dent in the country's morale. In 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American President Franklin D. Roosevelt traveled to Tehran, the capital city of Iran, to meet with the Soviet Union's leader, Joseph Stalin. The three superpowers discussed how best to end the war. Much to Churchill's chagrin, Stalin favored Roosevelt's Operation Overlord plan, and he was forced to accept that this was the way forward for the Allied forces. On the American side, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed to lead the American assault. And on the British side, Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery, or Monty, as he was more commonly known. Both men had seen active service, and both men were equally well respected and admired by the soldiers under their command, and the public hearing of their exploits. In all other respects, they were polar opposites. Eisenhower was a self-restrained, reserved, and well-read individual, while Montgomery was instinctive, resolved, and certainly didn't suffer fools gladly, particularly where red tape or rank stood in his way. Eisenhower's ability to keep Montgomery on side and still manage to work together towards their ultimate goal was one of World War II's most significant relationships. The worry was that by 1944, Hitler's European fortress seemed almost impenetrable and was protected in the West by what came to be known as the Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall was created as a gigantic trench-like system, much like the trenches used to secure positions overground by the opposing forces in the previous World War. It was built as a fortified position, the biggest of its kind in the history of warfare, by order of Adolf Hitler, and it was reinforced with massive concrete strongpoints. This Atlantic Wall of trenches was an impressive obstacle for the Allied planners to overcome. It was stuffed to the brim with pillboxes, giant cylindrical hollows of heavy concrete with a rectangular slab cut out as an eye hole, and with machine gun nests, which looked roughly the same as the pillboxes but with a bigger hole to shoot out of. Mammoth guns poked out of some of the bigger concrete bunkers, and the surrounding and forward-lying beaches were alive with deadly obstacles such as Belgian gates. These large pieces of perpendicular steel faced the sea and towered 10 feet high, festooned with anti-tank machines. Smaller wooden posts were also dug into the ground, pointing their anti-tank mines in the direction of the incoming tide. Probably the most dangerous obstacles on the beaches were the 6-foot-high hedgehogs, which consisted of star-shaped solid steel also topped with mines, which were designed to tear the hull of a passing boat to pieces if it ventured over them. Barbed wire, each sharp metal point glistening in the sun, curled around the beaches like a particularly vicious snake, and acres of minefields were planted like deadly flowers in order to trap an invading army. All of this was manned by stationary German East Battalion troops, which was an advantage for the Allied forces' destroyer ships, as they could easily see the best place to target their huge artillery. They had no need to try and outguess or outmaneuver their enemy, and this would be a huge bonus on the D-Day landings when trying to give some covering fire for the Allied invasion force. On top of the fact that none of the German East Battalion moved, half of them were not even trained soldiers at all, but recently captured Polish and Russian men, What the German troops didn't realize was that by making up half their Atlantic Wall army of prisoners, they increased their odds of losing any battle. At the first possible moment, the conscripted prisoners would either turn on their captors or surrender to the invading enemy. Since 1942, the Americans had persuaded the British to build up to Operation Overlord by a consistent campaign of bombing military targets in German-occupied Europe. Again, although fighting on the same side and for the same cause, the American and British divisions had vastly differing views when it came to carrying out these airborne raids. The Americans favored daylight precision bombing to destroy critical sectors of German industry, thus crippling their ability to churn out war machinery and demoralizing the German people. The British favored night bombing, as they argued that it was more cost-effective, and they targeted entire military and industrial areas. Even though both the American Air Force and the British Royal Air Force acted under their own orders, both managed to impair the building of planes and submarines, plus the disruption of transport networks and the destruction of oil plants. In the 5 months before D-Day, both the Americans and the British flying through the skies in such instantly memorable planes as the Spitfire, the Hawker Typhoon, the Mustang, the Lancaster bombers, and the P-38 Lightnings effectively destroyed the German Luftwaffe. Literally translated, Luftwaffe means air weapon, and the German Luftwaffe had, ever since World War I, been the premier air force in the world, fielding such classic planes as the Heinkel, Messerschmitt, and Stuka. However, the continual bombing campaigns and the increased fighter squadrons of the Allied forces overthrew the might of the legendary Luftwaffe to secure a safe passage across the English Channel when D-Day arrived. Over 25% of Germany's total fighter pilot squadrons perished in the month directly preceding D-Day. It is estimated that around 70% of the German Luftwaffe were destroyed in the lead-up to D-Day. Under what was called the Transportation Plan, the military operation of bombing specific targets in occupied Europe that ran from the start of 1944 right through to D-Day in June, the statistics are staggering. Over 200,000 missions were carried out against the invasion-related target areas by more than 11,000 Allied planes. Nearly 200,000 tons of bombs were dropped during this campaign, and in order not to indicate any area of specific interest, for each target bombed in the Normandy area, 2 targets were attacked elsewhere. The Germans were forced to guess at where the impending attack was going to take place, as they had garbled information coming from a variety of sources. The most famous double agent during the Second World War, a Spaniard named Juan Garcia, who operated under the code name of Garbo, managed to convince Adolf Hitler that the Normandy landings were just a decoy for the real invasion force to come ashore at the Pas de Calais, which is the shortest distance between England and France. This was coupled with a brilliant deception by the Americans, who set up a fake camp in Dover, England, using all the expertise and craftsmen from the motion picture capital of Hollywood to mock up dummy tanks, artillery guns, trucks, boats, and aircraft in order to convince the Germans that it was going to be the short hop from Dover to Calais where the invasion would take place. Yet another deception was made possible due to the code-breaking facility at Bletchley Park, near Milton Keynes in Buckinghamshire, England. They had captured a German Army Enigma machine and broke the code it used to send messages. In doing so, they were able to find out where the German troops were moving to and from, in order for the Allied attack to be more successful. They could also tell how well the dummy invasion plans were being accepted by the enemy. Because of this, soldiers were sent with easily decoded messages to the shores of Norway and the far reaches of Scotland to suggest a separate invasion was going to happen there as well. The Germans stretched themselves thin to try and cover all the areas that they assumed the Allied forces were going to attack. It is a well-documented fact that for a good few months after the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, Adolf Hitler and the German army were still awaiting the real attack from their enemy via Norway and Scotland. The training for D-Day was so realistic that when the soldiers boarded the transport ships for the real assault on Normandy, most of them just saw it as yet another exercise. Real ammunition had been used for training purposes, and troops had been cordoned off in a large area of southern Britain to mimic the Normandy coastline. Sometimes whole villages were evacuated, and two of them, Tyneham and Imber, still remain under the Ministry of Defense's jurisdiction. Ghost towns lying untouched since the end of the Second World War. Barely a month before the D-Day landings, a couple of German E-boats managed to make their way into Slapton Sands, a stretch of beach near Lyme Bay, England, after hearing heavy radio traffic. Upon discovering an operational exercise for the landing of American troops on Utah Beach for D-Day, the Germans instantly set about attacking the outfit. Their swift and decisive strike lost the American army roughly 800 soldiers and seriously wounded another 300. June the 5th was the date decided by American General Ike Eisenhower for the Allied invasion of Normandy. Operation Overlord was dictated by the weather, the moon, and the tides, because of the fact that visibility needed to be good for the paratroopers to glide in on the first wave of attack behind the enemy lines. And the tide on the shore of the beaches chosen had to be low enough to allow the transport ships to get close enough in to release all the soldiers and the semi-aquatic tanks. The 5 beaches chosen were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. As the troops boarded their transports, aware of the life and death situation that faced them, they were each given a short, self-penned speech by General Eisenhower. It read, "Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the Great Crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. The initial Operation Overlord was stopped dead in the water before it even started. Unfavorable weather conditions and a rough sea made General Eisenhower call a 24-hour delay, and everyone returned to shore. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was determined to take an active part in D-Day and told the general he would be traveling on board the HMS Belfast. Eisenhower forbade it because of Churchill's worth to the Allies and the amazing morale boost it would give to the German army if he was captured or killed. Churchill counteracted this polite way of saying, "No, you can't go," by suggesting he was going to sign on as a British crew member, and there was nothing an American general could do about it. Fortunately, this American general was a mastermind of tactical maneuvers, and he placed a telephone call to King George VI. King George, rightly agreeing with Eisenhower's assessment, told Churchill that if he was going to be a part of the D-Day invasions, so was the king. This stopped Winston Churchill immediately, as losing the king would have been the worst thing that could happen. The king had called his bluff. The weather forecast for the next morning was more akin to what was required, and 13,000 aircraft took to the skies to begin Operation Overlord. Some of them carried something like 20,000 parachutists who were dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt communications, cut off key roads and bridges, and take up strategic positions before the arrival of the infantry. A floating armada of 6,000 ships sailed out from England to endure the long, rough crossing of the English Channel. They carried 20,000 vehicles, 190,000 soldiers, and 200,000 seamen. This was in the early hours of June the 6th, 1944, and D-Day had begun. Halfway across the English Channel, at the point jokingly referred to as Piccadilly Circus, which is a congested roundabout in the center of London, England, the flotilla of ships broke into two sections. Going west to the beaches of Utah and Omaha were the American troops. Going east to take the remaining beaches were the combined forces of Britain, Canada, and the other Allied nations. Due to poor visibility, the Germans were still not aware of the incoming ships, as many of their radar stations had been destroyed by the first onslaught of planes. Even worse for the German army, but something of a coup for the Allied forces, was the fact that the German high-ranking commanders were out on an exercise together, and their tactically brilliant and much-loved commanding officer General Erwin Rommel had briefly returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. In the very early hours of the morning, the first troops arrived in Normandy. These were the Air and Glider-borne Brigade, and most of them, due to an unscheduled diversion because of cloud cover, had landed in the completely wrong positions. Several plane loads of these courageous soldiers were accidentally dropped into the English Channel, or bog-like marshlands, and due to the incredible weight of their packs, were sadly drowned. But small groups of this plucky first wave managed to secure the essential bridges and roads, which would help get the troops off the beaches as quickly as possible once they got past the German defenses of the Atlantic Wall. As the sun began to rise in the cloudy sky, the 5 beaches chosen for the Normandy landings suddenly became alive with deadly explosions. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword were being bombarded with shell after shell of a pre-invasion attack, which came out of the morning air like deadly rain, fired from cruisers, destroyers, and battleships, which lay off the coast of France. The Germans knew this was the time of the invasion, and they would have to defend these beaches to the very last man. As the invasion force began to arrive, they realized that the strong underwater currents of the English Channel had led them off course. This proved a fortuitous mistake for the American troops, who were deployed in 3 sectors on Utah Beach, as they turned up at the less heavily guarded sectors and were able to secure a position inland much quicker than had been expected. The steering off course helped save many lives, and there were certainly fewer casualties on Utah than there would be on the neighboring beach of Omaha. By midday, the beach had been taken, and all exits had been secured as they met up with their paratroopers who were defending the inland roads. By the end of a long and bloody day, Utah's contingent of soldiers had exceeded all expectations and were within a mile of meeting up with the 82nd Airborne Division's captured territory. The Leclerc Monument marks the very spot where the original landing on Utah Beach should have taken place. The fortifications that are still on show today highlight how much more difficult it would have been for the American invasion force had they not been dragged off course by the current. As it was, the casualties on Utah Beach were relatively low, and hardly any equipment and military hardware was lost. On the other hand, the bloodiest and most disastrous invasion was that of their countrymen on Omaha Beach. The first problem that befell the American troops that tried to land there was that the weak German battalion troops that were commanding most of the Atlantic Wall defense had very recently been replaced by loyal, entirely German and battle-seasoned troops of a different battalion. These German troops weren't even affected by the bombardment of shelling and gunfire from the nearby American vessels, as everything was falling too short. Most were arriving too late, and all of them were highly inaccurate. Machine guns raked across the sand with tremendous power and mowed down hundreds of soldiers before they could even get on to the beach properly. The seawall that many troops had hid behind on other beaches was getting continually blown apart by mortar fire, and the American soldiers who sheltered behind it were being killed in droves. Within 10 minutes of landing, every officer and sergeant of the 116th Regiment was dead or wounded, and the Americans sustained 3,000 casualties in the first few hours. By 10 a.m., only 300 men had managed to struggle ashore safely. As the carnage and the long, long day wore on, the tide slowly turned on Omaha Beach, as destroyers risked running aground to take out the deadly pillar boxes of artilleries and the hidden defenses of the German army snipers. Eventually, the Germans began to run out of ammunition, and slowly but surely the battle-weary Americans captured vital positions, forced surrender from many German soldiers, and finally secured Omaha Beach for an Allied victory. They fell short of their objective, but they did what was needed, and the men that were lost because of it were mourned as the brave heroes that they were. It was only several days later, after more vicious and vigorous fighting, that the Americans linked up with their counterparts at Utah Beach and the British at Gold Beach. One of the most significant events that bridged the gap between the Americans invading Omaha Beach and the Americans invading Utah Beach was the taking of Pointe du Hoc. This was a tall cliff that jutted out over both beaches and housed a huge artillery bunker that could fire shells onto Utah and Omaha, devastating the American invasion force. Even before D-Day, the Allies realized the danger of such a high and heavily manned outpost. They hit it with everything they had during the early air raids, and when the destroyers and cruisers dotted the waters of the English Channel on June the 6th, it was one of the first targets their guns aimed for. Leading 3 companies of trained men from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, Colonel James E. Rudder disobeyed a direct order to pay no heed to trying to capture Pointe du Hoc and went ahead anyway. He believed it would be vital to the safety of the men invading Omaha and Utah. A huge casualty rate didn't stop the American battalion from using specially prepared extendable fire ladders to scale the cliff face. The sight that greeted them at the top was not one of a huge gun battery, but just horizontal telegraph poles. After the air raids, the guns had been moved backwards onto safer ground. The American Rangers found and destroyed them, including the ammunition, and held on to Pointe du Hoc under extreme duress until reinforcements arrived. If you visit this site today, it has a rare, untouched quality to it, which allows you to peer back in time and imagine what those gallant Americans had to endure. Meanwhile, the British invasion of Gold Beach and Sword Beach were easier than that at Omaha, but nevertheless still hard fought. In fact, Gold Beach was the most lightly defended and was overrun by the British in a mere 35 minutes. The only problem that did occur on the neighboring Sword Beach was the English failure to link up with the Canadians at Juno Beach. This created a 2-mile gap between the two beaches, and this was exploited in the only major counterattack of the day by the German Army 21st Panzer Division. Juno Beach, the Canadian infantry were heavily outnumbered, and even though they had the air and sea backup, the casualty rate was 1 in 2. After a long fight, the Canadians eventually battled through to secure the beach. Nobody can truly estimate how many lives were lost on that fateful day. Some reports say 5,000, some say 10,000. Five years before he died, General Eisenhower came back to Omaha Beach. It was the first and only time he returned there. He spoke these simple words from his heart. These men came here, British and our allies and Americans, to storm these beaches for one purpose only, not to gain anything for ourselves, not to fulfill any ambitions that America had for conquest, but just to preserve freedom. Many thousands of men have died for such ideals as these, but these young boys were cut off in their prime. I devoutly hope that we will never again have to see such scenes as these. I think and hope and pray that humanity will have learned we must find some way to gain an eternal peace for this world. From film crews at the time of the D-Day landings, it's an enlightening experience to see soldiers being shot down and slumping lifeless to the floor. We must remember that this isn't a movie. These aren't actors, and this isn't computer-generated effects. These film crews captured real life and death on D-Day. and they risked their own lives to record the footage for posterity. After the incredible events of D-Day, the Allied forces advanced inland, and the Battle of Normandy officially ended in late August when American troops surrounded and destroyed the German 7th Army. It was the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler and his evil regime. On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide while hiding away in a bunker beneath the Chancellery in Berlin, Germany. For Europe, the war was over, and the Allies christened the 8th of May VE Day, which is often better known as Victory in Europe Day, and everyone celebrated the fall of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. Although the celebrations were long and loud, the American troops were reticent to join in for too long, as they were still fighting their final battle with the tenacious Japanese army in the Pacific region. This was a nation who refused to submit to anyone or anything. The much-loved and admired President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, failed to see the end of the Second World War as ill health finally took its toll, and he passed away from a stroke on April the 12th, 1945. Harry S. Truman, who had only served a mere 82 days as his vice president, was sworn in and was instantly faced with the unenviable task of deciding whether the dropping of an atomic bomb on Japan would put an end to the conflict. The nuclear weapon of mass destruction was dropped on Hiroshima and then used on the city of Nagasaki not long afterwards. The Japanese surrendered, and the Second World War finally came to a bitter close. D-Day had been the turning point for the Second World War, the main event that signaled the beginning of the end. The amount of lives lost on this one day was incalculable. The pain suffered is unimaginable, and the nightmares revisited for decades afterwards are unanswerable. Just above Omaha Beach now stands the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial, covering over 100 acres of French land donated by the people of France to the nearly 10,000 military dead of the United States of America. A white marble headstone marks each of the graves. Those of Jewish faith bear a Star of David, and everybody else has a simple Latin cross. The dead rest in a sacred peace, safe in the knowledge that they played their part in the liberation of France, the breaking of the Nazi stranglehold on the world, and the setting of a precedent to fight tyranny whenever and wherever it threatens humanity. Sleep softly, brave soldiers. The world salutes you.